right, so we are live with Innovation Hour. Today, not with Edgar at the moment, but with a new super special guest, another Jon Walton. So I'm JSaye, aka JSaye. And in this podcast YouTube series, what we do is talk about the design of what's possible. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you, Jon. Thanks for stopping in. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, a brief intro so the crowd can get a feel for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here, and I hope Edgar joins us as well, because I think that'll enrich the conversation a little bit. But a little bit about me, I guess, what I do primarily in my work now is I work with leaders and teams and organizations that are really interested in developing some of the skills necessary to support multicultural teams. So my kind of thing is I focus on, hey, how do we make sure that we're learning these lessons and that we're applying them to new programs and new projects. So as we think about all these great intercultural teams and the diversity that we see around the world, I'm trying to help teams figure out, how do I coach? How do I communicate? How do I make sure that I get the most out of them? Because we know that they're most productive in terms of diverse intercultural teams. And so the question becomes, hey, how do I get everything that I can out of this team and out of myself as a leader, because we're looking to a bunch of folks to do that work these days.
Wow. That's at this moment in time, as we were discussing before we hit the live button, extremely important, and also at the top of mind of everyone, not just in America, but the world. I mean, it's amazing how over the past couple weeks, the spotlight's been shown again on some problems with the systems that we've relied upon. And so I think it's great that you've been doing that in a professional realm. And now I know it's all hit us harder on a personal realm. Like, it's something that we can't ignore anymore, right? So how did you end up getting into that line of work, specifically for multicultural?
Yeah, I guess, I kind of came into it from the business or professional side. So it was really personal for me, the way I kind of did this. I started out my career professionally. I worked actually in a super high-end hotel in Washington, D.C., and there was probably people from 30, 40 different countries there, and they probably spoke at least as many languages, if not more. And like the team, like that place was an amazing operation, like just one of the best operations. And I've been involved in hotels for a long time before that. So that floored me. And then it just kind of continued on. And when I kind of got into tech and I joined IBM, and then I started to work with teams around the globe, and I started to see how sometimes teams and team members have to assume or kind of accept the dominant culture. And sometimes there's more of a blending that went on. And so for me, I really started to take interest in, hey, how does that work? And how does the team perform? And what makes a good team? Because, at that time I've been doing consulting, for a number of years. And it was always interesting to me which teams performed well and which ones didn't. And it wasn't always just about who had the best talent. Right. Sometimes you can put the best talent, hey, here's my expert from this space, here's my expert from this space, put them in a room and they just can't work it out. And so that's really where my interest started, was looking at how these teams work together and what were the factors that made some of them really, really good, and which were the ones that were held back by some other challenges. So that's kind of my entree into this. And then as I work with more tech and we start talking about, I think you and I touched on this a little bit, but like agile solutions. And when we start talking about design thinking, and like you have all these things that can really amplify performance. And for me, it was just a question of, man, how do you put them together to really create something special? And so that's really what I've been focusing on for the last, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years now.
That sounds pretty fun. The example that it makes me think of, so my introduction into design thinking was in the desert of Spain in this tiny studio. And my teammates or coworkers, whatever you want to call them, were from Greece, India, Nigeria, Belgium, and me from Louisiana, and then 1 or 2 people from Spain. That was the most multicultural experience I could ever ask for. And it was great because we were literally testing the theory that people from different backgrounds, when they come together and use a process, given, say you can call it design thinking, whatever process you might apply, can actually get to better results. We were competing with other people that were 100% Spanish, 100% American, and we were out there in the desert like a bunch of crazy people coming up with new products and new marketing campaigns. And for me, it just tested, you can't see your own bias, right? So I can try and understand where, because of where I was born or how I grew up or how I was raised, where my blind spots are, but I'm never going to be able to fully see them. And to be called out consistently day to day on my blind spots, whether that be, one example was people traveling in Asia care more about insurance, travel insurance, than anything else. They need that before they decide where they're going to go on a trip. Never would have crossed my mind, right? I want to find the cheapest plane ticket. So even that small behavior, which is so tiny, makes a huge difference in just the process of recognizing how to help people get what they need. And it was an incredible experience for me, but I'm not sure what factors made my team successful, right? I know we're from different backgrounds. I know we were ambitious and we had a good balance of chiefs, like people that are leading, and people that were meant to kind of be gatherers. They're hunters and gatherers. So we had a good balance, and everybody kind of fell into these roles where some were better at finding information, some were better at communicating, right? But what's the recipe for a good multicultural team for you, like a blueprint, if you will?
Yeah, I guess, when I think about it, and what I see is that there are, a few factors that obviously have to be in place. So one is you've got to have a diverse team. And so when I talk about diversity, I kind of think about what we call the diversity dimensions, right? So it may be age, gender, sexual orientation, race, those types of things. And so when you have diversity, and especially kind of two or more, that's where you can really start to see the benefits. If you've kind of got that one person that's the lone outsider kind of within those, across those dimensions, you're not going to get the benefits because people are still less enabled to share their full selves and their true thoughts. So, so if you have that in place, and so assuming that you have that level of diversity in place, then, you gotta have the right leader in place. We always talk about this, right? From a leadership and from everything you do, is that if you don't have the support of leaders, then your programs are usually going to fail. And this is no different. Like, leading a multicultural or an intercultural team is no different. You've got to have a leader that's on board, that buys into it, and that can actually effectively manage the team. And I think that's one of the gaps that I'm starting to see now, is that people are realizing that they may not necessarily have all of the skills they need to manage these teams effectively. So get that leader in place, or at least get them some training. And then the third thing you have to do, just as a collective, is you've got to start working on those skills, right? Those intercultural skills. So, it kind of starts with just awareness, right? Am I aware of other cultures? Do I know what goes on? So, your example about travel insurance is a good one, right? Like, hey, I may not have been aware of that before, or of that concern, or of that issue. And now that you are, now you've got awareness, and now you've got knowledge, right? And then you've got these resources in your tool bag that you can go out and ask, hey, what are some other concerns, right? Now you're becoming a much more aware and knowledgeable resource. And then you just go out and apply the skills. And it sounds like that's what you guys did, with this team, is that once you start to understand and people can start to say, hey, this is a concern. I mean, and you can think of a lot of projects where you've kind of seen that, where people contribute things that are unique to their culture or to their background that really make a huge improvement. And I used to do enterprise software stuff. And so for me, it was always interesting to go around the world, because I used to do a lot of global projects, and talk to different people in different regions and understand what their needs were, right? And so usually if we came from the US, we just do it this way. Like one was like, let's just say invoicing, or figuring out where to drop product, and you're trying to find the address. Well, vendors from South America and Mexico and everywhere else are telling us they're street vendors. They don't have an address, right? So every time I go to drop off Pepsi or Coke or whatever it is, they're in a different spot. And so you start to think about some of the solutions you design that won't work in certain places. And so for me, that was like this, whoa, you know, eye-opening thing again, where you realize that when teams come together and people come together, that's where the strength is. So to me, when I sit back and I look at like, what do you need to have in place? You've got to have those people, you've got to have the right leader, you got to have the diversity. Then you've got to have people that are really willing to build their skills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it really plays into the who. You mentioned the leaders, but also there's the company culture that comes along with it. An example that jumps to my mind is I was sitting in a workshop for leadership, and there were about 5 different companies sitting at different tables. And I sat down with one and just listened like a fly on the wall. And they were discussing company culture and how one of their employees totally didn't fit in. And they were talking about it because these were all very dedicated, very religious Southern Baptists, which are very vocal people. They are, and they had hired someone who was extremely qualified, but was Muslim, and so they didn't really know how to interact with that person because they had never been around a Muslim person. They grew up in a place where that really wasn't a factor. And when they saw a qualified person try to bring them in, their skills weren't allowed to flourish because of that one fear of interaction and doing something wrong, but also that lack of understanding and that awareness. So how can companies or employees kind of try and develop this awareness? Do you have any practices you can teach us for people? I mean, for me, travel was huge from a small town. I got lucky. My parents are very open-minded, even though I am from a small town that historically has some bad problems with racism, with multicultural groups, right? But my parents weren't that way. They actually taught me how to be better, and they made me travel. And travel was the thing that changed my life. But not everybody can afford to fly across the world. So are there any tools or practices that you've seen working for people?
Yeah, you bring up a good one. I think exposure is huge, and you know, there's different ways you can obtain or at least get some exposure, you know, without the travel necessarily, right? And so for some folks, maybe it's getting into some online forum where you start to get involved in some discussion group. I think for other folks, you know, there's a lot of volunteer opportunities or ways to get involved, you know, whether it's kind of your local community resource center or whatever that might look like. And getting involved and saying, hey, where can I just show up and help out, right? So if you've got skills, you can lend those skills. And, you know, that's something that I do, and I actually encourage a lot of my friends to do, because it's a good way to see what's going on in your community. And then you also get exposed to exactly that, right? A lot of people that don't live a life like yours. And so to me, I think at the community level, it's a really good way to get involved. And then it also helps you, you know, I guess my thing is that once I meet somebody, it's usually hard to not like them, right? But man, if I don't know you and I see you and I've got all these stories that I've told myself or that society has told me about you,
Right.
man, I've got a lot of fear built up. But boy, as soon as I start to interact and I'm like, oh, you know, that person really wasn't so bad, or that wasn't what I thought it was going to be, then it makes it a lot easier to go out then and taking that next step. So for me, I think that getting out in the community is big. And if your community isn't super diverse, then you've got to find other ways, whether it's online or something else. I think reading books and all of that is really good and helpful, but boy, there's nothing like being able to practice, if you know what I mean, to be able to sit in space with someone else and either listen or learn. And one thing I'll say is that with COVID, there's been like this explosion in the offerings of groups that used to be kind of face-to-face, one-on-one, you had to show up, and now it's virtual. So, you know, you could join a virtual group that's discussing anything anywhere in the world these days, which you know, it's a good thing. I guess that's what I get at. It's like COVID, you know, some bad stuff coming out of that, but the upside is that I think it has opened up our ability to gain more exposure to different cultures and different, you know, kind of dimensions of diversity.
Yeah. And you mentioned community. I had the pleasure of meeting the former urban designer, the leader of Helsinki, Finland, and they did something interesting. So they started applying design thinking to how they structured their city, not just the projects they worked on, but physically where people lived and how they actually flow through the city to try and instead of taxing for wealth, to try and encourage people just by the way they physically move the city to spend their money in different locations so that they could try to create a level playing field, which I thought was amazing. But it's just an example of an attempt at changing the system to make the opportunities maybe a lot more level, but at least give a fighting chance and do it in a way that's very subtle and very it's almost simple. So that Occam's razor, right? The simplest solution is probably the most correct. And another example is street lights. I know several cities have fixed street lights in lower income neighborhoods, and actually the crime rate went down. Major problems simply evaporated overnight, right? Just with lights. So using that kind of approach of design thinking to identify problems or rearrange the physical space we live in could have huge effects on actually the system itself. So have you thought about applying design in any kind of strategies like that? Or do you think it's possible to use that type of design and apply it in America? I've mentioned places abroad, but do you have any examples yourself?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there's one right now, there's great opportunities to apply some design thinking techniques to the challenges we're facing right now. Right. And so,
Mhm.
you know, the interesting thing to me that, you know, it sounds like that you've done and you had in your experience is that you get groups and organizations together to identify the problem, right? And you get a bunch of different voices and input, and then you figure it out from there. And so, you know, you've got to do that work up front. I used to be the chair of a local radio station, community radio station, and we were going through a process of popping the top on our building and creating this into a more of a multicultural media space.
Mhm.
And one of the first things we did was we hired in a design firm to come in and do about 3 sessions, you know, with the on-air DJs, with the volunteers, with people in the community, to really start to understand what they needed in that space. Because, you know, we could have just gone in there and plopped down a bunch of studios and added a couple more, you know, whatever, and that would have been it. But boy, doing the design work with the community, we realized, oh, people wanted a coffee shop. They wanted some place to be able to come out and watch the DJs do their thing, you know, or to listen to live music. And so we got a bunch of inputs that we probably wouldn't have received had we not gone through that process. So again, I say, we have to be so intentional about making sure that the feedback that we get when we design solutions is from the folks that have experienced the challenges.
Yes. Yeah. And I know, so I'm always focused on strategy and thinking what's next. So I'm a bit ahead of where probably people are at right now. It's a moment of rage, frustration, stress from COVID, only quadrupled degree from the stress of police brutality and systematic racism, right? So I'm probably looking farther ahead than most people. There definitely needs to be a grieving period that we go through. But what do you think is gonna? Now I'm not asking you to be a crystal ball, but trying to figure out where we go from here. We have all this energy as a society right now. How do you think we could twist it into not just permanent change, but positive energy? Because we're teetering on the edge right now. And I'm
Yeah.
asking you some big questions, Mr. President. Right? We need some powerful answers.
Yeah, I don't know that I have all the answers, or certainly that I have the right answers. But you know, as you know, like in the design thinking world, like we got to try. We have to try something, and we have to try something different. Like if there's one thing that I've realized and I've received from a lot of conversations I've had with friends of mine, it's just that we got to do something, right? Like we can't do what we've done in the past in terms of seeing a problem, applying a very loose band-aid, and
Mm-hmm.
then moving on, and you know, being surprised when it comes up again, you know, a year, 2, 5, whatever later. And so, you know, when I think about it, I think we've got to be able to sit down and have these honest conversations, right? About,
Yeah.
again, what are the impacts and how are you impacted? And then what's the right way to start to look at solutions. And I don't think that we've done that because I don't think that we as a country in the US, in the United States of America, have been ready to have that conversation, right? It's a painful conversation.
Yeah.
There's no ways around it. It's going to be a painful conversation. Some people are going to be hurt. Some people are going to have their feelings hurt. Some people are, but I go back then to like where I'm centered in kind of the way I see the teams innovate and the way that I see intercultural teams do well is that they learn how to communicate through conflict and in conflict, right? And so, because that's the beauty of where the creativity comes from. It comes from the conflict. It comes from understanding, oh, this is why you are so upset. This is why this matters so much to you, or this is why you see this way. And then we can start to put a couple different perspectives together, then hopefully do what design thinking does, right? And start to building solutions and trying them out, because the solution that works for you in Louisiana is different than the one that works here in Colorado, and is certainly different than the one that's going to work in New York City, right? But boy, they all are going to have the same theme, and I bet you they're all going to be addressing largely these very similar issues. And so, to me, I think the work has to come from us as a community, because, and I feel like now I keep on saying community all the time, but
it's an important word right now.
Many of us have lived in communities, right? I mean, I live in a community here, but am I a part of it, right? And how deeply am I a part of that community? And if the only people I know in the community are the people that live in my neighborhood, that's a sign that we need to check where we're at. And so to me, as I look to like, how the heck do we move forward from here? I want people to get involved in their community. I want them to start having those community conversations, and then starting to figure out what are the things that I can change, and some of them are easy fixes to them, and some of them are longer term, and you just have to decide where you can apply your skills, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote I read earlier. Don't try and change the world, try and change yourself, right? A lot of people just need to try and proactively go out there and make themselves better, myself included. A lot of times I find my heart is still out in Spain, so I'm constantly looking to Spain for all my energy outside of work, when I could be dedicating time to making where I live better. Things change faster when you start small. I've seen it in companies all the time. You say you work with teams, you start with one team and they're super successful using a given process, mixing different types of people together. Then everyone else looks to that team and wants to emulate that. And so they start changing their behaviors. And I think that same concept could be applied, even if it's not to a whole community, at least a group of individuals making a change on a small scale, and then other people being inspired to attempt that same thing. And like you mentioned, trying, the importance of trying. It's odd because I feel like we live in this time where no one wants to fail. So we're like walking the tightrope again, where I don't want to make a misstep and seem like one type or the other type, because we've got extremes with parties. We've got extremes with pretty much with everything right now. We're just on, is COVID created by Bill Gates, or, you know what I mean? It's like extremes in every direction. But we have to be willing to try, or go ahead.
No, I'm with you on that try thing, because like, it seems we have grown reluctant to fail.
Right.
Right. And it really holds us back from innovation. And, there have been some cool, innovative things that have come out, but imagine where we could be if we weren't so afraid to fail. And I look at, like, when I go into organizations and start to talk about this, ask these organizations, what do you reward? What do you compensate? Right? Do you compensate and do you reward failure? Or are you only rewarding success? And so if you're only rewarding success, people are only going to do what is guaranteed and what is kind of, it's incremental success, right? But you're not going to get any big changes. You're not going to get, like, especially when we talk about the issues of today, you're not going to get those types of systemic or institutional change that you desire, because people are afraid. There's no reward for me taking a big risk. There's no reward in many of these systems for people putting themselves out there. And so why do it? Right. And so, I have a buddy that was one of the, I don't know, probably one of the first 10 employees at Amazon. And so conversations with him are always really interesting about how they have looked at, and, I say Amazon and they've got their own challenges, but boy, from the perspective of how they innovate and how they build solutions, it's impressive. They reward people for trying things, and they reward people for failing, and that failure is just another stepping stone to that greater success. And I think that that's one of the things I'd love for us to take and apply to kind of today's situation, which is, I was talking to a client of mine the other day about the issues of the day and said, hey, you're going to fail. You're going to misspeak. You're going to put a tweet or a quote or something on Facebook that maybe isn't perfect, but man, you got to put something out there, right? And we've got to learn that way. And so to me, I hope that we can all sit back and say, hey, what is that right next step for me? And am I really afraid to fail? Am I afraid to fail in having a conversation? Am I afraid to fail in applying X, Y, or Z? And if that's what it is, that's the work I think we have to do as a society, right? Is address this fear of failure.
Definitely. And another thing I've seen is actually, so we won't say a right or wrong, but people from, say, protesters are taking extreme action sometimes and turning into looting, right? But that's just a small section of the group. But what I have seen happen is an unwillingness to try and understand the group that isn't coming with us, right? The group that isn't protesting with us in the streets. An unwillingness to understand those people. I know it seems backwards at times to try and empathize with the person you're disagreeing with when you fully believe they're in the wrong. But the only way I've ever seen effective change or convincing or any good argument that you try and win is by fully understanding the other person and where they're coming from, regardless of whether you believe it's wrong or right. And I think that ability to empathize in both directions, obviously getting a racist to empathize with another race is a complex thing, but getting someone who isn't a racist to try and understand where that racist's values lie and then connect with those to kind of bring them towards you is something that I think is extremely powerful. And I'm afraid people are getting a little bit out of touch. I mean, we're so angry that we kind of jumped over logic, and we're going to need a lot of logic to try and work our way out of the system that a large population of our friends, our family are living in today. So how have you, I'll get it down, I'll bring it down, I'll land it for you. How have you tried to teach other people to empathize better? I know we talked about awareness, but do you have any practices that you work with teams? Do you have any practices or exercises you do to help people empathize better other than just a workshop?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's right. It's all about, can I internalize what I hear you saying or what I think you're experiencing, right? I mean, that's all about the empathy and the empathetic side of us as humans. And so one of the things that I try to say is that, if you've got space with another individual, then can you sit down with them and kind of have that one-on-one conversation, right? Hey, I'm not quite getting you. I'm not aligning with you. I don't see it. And this doesn't mean that we have to agree.
Right.
But boy, the dialogue is about coming to understand your perspective, right? And how do you come to the position you hold? And so I can understand that and may not necessarily agree with you. And so the practice is in doing that work, right? Which is asking a lot of questions. Hey,
right.
How did you come to that understanding? And why do you feel that way? And what is your concern? What's your fear? What do you think will happen? Understanding somebody from that perspective, I think, is really helpful. If you've got somebody that can obviously be open with you and have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think helps in terms of being empathetic is if you're by yourself, doing that work, that really internal reflection and saying, why, let me try to reverse it and saying the protesters, why do you think that person doesn't want to go out and support the protest, right? What is it about them? Is it fear? Is it that they think that it's wrong? Is they think that it's degrading our society and, confusing our morality or whatever it is? And trying to understand that just for yourself And then that helps you to be able to create the questions that you then might want to be able to go up and follow up on, right? Which is like, wow, you know, I've been doing some thinking on this, and boy, I really feel that maybe, you know, either you're afraid or that you're concerned about society, or, you know, a couple generations down the line, because that's what we've got to get to, right? It's not just that I think or you think that X is wrong. I need to understand why you feel X is wrong. And then that helps me build my argument. If I'm gonna, you know, pushing for my position, it helps me understand what your fears and concerns are, right? And I think that's one of the things that we haven't done very well as a society, which is really listening to people's fears and concerns and accepting them at face value, because my experience is different than yours. So the things that I feared different than you know, with typical one that, you know, black and white folks use is that when the police lights light up, I'm fearful. As a white person, you might not have that same reaction. Valid or not, that's my reaction.
Right.
And so I think that's what I get to, is that we've got to get to the point where we can actually hear that out and respect where people are, even if we don't agree with it. And I think that sometimes is hard, because we want everyone to be on our side.
Yes. Yeah. And it's just not going to happen. You're never going to win over everyone. A small example is I genuinely think I'm incredible at speeches. I think it's my natural superpower. That's what my mom calls it. My ability to just get in front of a group of people and give a speech that entertains and engages. Giving a speech to a group of students that were from all over the world. The Belgian students did not like the way I spoke. They did not want to hear anything I said. And it's because the way I speak is often more on the emotional side, more on the playful side, and with zero facts, right? I'm very feeling and not facts. They weren't going to buy what I was selling. So in order to actually get them to understand where I was coming from and kind of show my point and try and convince them, I had to see what their pains and gains were, write them down, and then, okay, when I give the next presentation, I'll make sure to include some statistics that add some meat to these bones, right? And that's kind of what we need to do with society a little bit. It's too far apart. You can't pull it all together, but you got to get a few strands running.
Yeah, and to me, what you describe is that you're developing your cultural awareness, right? So, and it's really hard to do what you described doing, which is like going out and speaking to a multicultural audience, right? Because you've got to account for many things, right? Some people are emotional, some people just want the data. And so to me, that's like one of the interesting things too about, you know, global teams and global projects and people that work around the world, is that you've always got to be flipping through your mind, like, who is this person? What culture are they from? And how do I best communicate whatever I'm trying to get across, right? And so it's like you said, for some folks, you got to have the data. For some folks, you've got to have that emotional kind of heartstring pull. And you've got to be able to blend those throughout the presentation, right? And so the effective leaders, that especially effective global leaders that we see, right, are the ones that are able to recognize the cultural differences and then communicate effectively so that they get that level of support. Otherwise, you know, you're talking to a quarter of your audience potentially. Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate that.
I definitely think learning a new language and being immersed in a place that you don't know that language, huge advantage as far as your ability to understand other people's reaction to what you're saying without them saying anything, right? So living in Brazil, had to learn Portuguese, didn't know anything. And I just had to read faces to try and interpret what people were saying to me and if what I was saying resonated with them. And that ability, fortunately, has stayed with me afterwards, to where when I am in a meeting or even on a Zoom call, although it's very difficult on a Zoom call because you can't see the full body, my ability to kind of read what the other person's thinking before they even speak to me has been a huge advantage, and my ability to develop my own self-awareness. I think a big thing is listening more than you speak. So most of the conversations before I went to another country, I was always trying to match someone else's story, right? Trying to outdo them. Wow, that's so cool, but listen to what I did, right? And build on top of them. So we were competing in this conversation and not actually listening and interacting. So once I figured out if I was just to ask questions and try and get to know the other person better, our relationship actually went a lot further. So as opposed to trying to explain everything about me, now I really enjoy sitting back and trying to ask questions that let me dive deeper into that person's experience. And the funny thing is, when you do that, the other person often likes you even more because it makes them feel good to share.
Yeah, and especially in cultures where that's valued, right? Where there's some cultures where you're not going to get any business done if you walk in and just lay everything on the paper on the table and say, "Let's get to work," right? I mean, there are cultures where you've got to do that work. You know, you've got to get to know you. Hey, how's your family? How are you? That whole thing. And so, to me, that it's that level of sensitivity that we need to foster a little bit more, because I'm with you. I started a project in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And, I think my boss's boss called me up and said, can you get down there and help him out on this thing, kind of emergency project? And I'm like, well, I have, a couple of years in Spanish that I think I finished when I was in 8th grade.
Hope it sticks.
Talking about, right? So being thrown into an environment, and so it was one where I was actually forced to listen, right? One, because my communication skills weren't up to par. I mean, I could, obviously my understanding, my comprehension was a lot better than my spoken abilities, but it was really interesting through that process of really having to focus on listening, right? How much more you learn, right? As opposed to me having to think about saying anything, like the pressure was off me in a way to be a spokesperson and to get up and talk a lot initially. And so, boy, the ability to just focus on understanding how I'm different, was so helpful to me. And then of course I did my work, which was, me and another guy would have dinner together, and his English was as bad as my Spanish was, and so, we would just sit down together every night and just kind of have these conversations in broken English and broken Spanish. That one, helped us bond a lot closer, but two, also really showed me the work that we have to do, right? Like, our project was not going to be successful unless we kind of built that relationship and we did those things. And so I think I guess I'm rambling on and kind of getting to this to say that it's work and it takes time. And I think that's the one thing that I'm concerned about right now in our times, is that we want quick fixes so bad. And I don't sense that this is going to be a quick fix, but boy, if we do the work, kind of like, we're talking about learning about these people, about these cultures, about experiences, that we'll be in a better spot. But the question is how dedicated can we be to that effort?
Will we put our energy in the right place? Exactly. I'm worried about our focus. It's like the internet taught us how to not focus on anything, right? I guess I grew up in the age where one foot was in digital and one foot was in the past, right? My first cell phone was the Nokia phone that was a brick that you could like throw across the room and it would be perfectly okay.
Right.
So I feel like I had an understanding of my ability to focus without toys, focus on one thing. And then the internet came in, gave us so much information that we were unable to focus on one thing, find the truth even. It's funny to see how over the past 10 years, trust in media has completely evaporated in a lot of sections of the world. So our ability to find the truth, establish a source of truth is very important. But like you mentioned, our ability to focus and work on the task at hand and make sure there'll be distractions. There'll be other big problems that happen. I mean, we're a huge country. We have a lot of people from all over the world, right? So different needs and different problems. I mean, gun violence has always been a problem. These are massive, wicked problems that aren't solved in 1 week, in 1 day, in 1 year, in one generation. These are things that take time to develop. And I hope that it's an energy that we can sustain and use appropriately, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, as we start to get into finding solutions to these challenges, I think that we're going to get there fairly soon. At least in my mind, I'm kind of like you, which is, some days I'm bogged down and weighed down a little bit by what's going on, but
Right.
I've got to keep looking towards the future and what's next. And so when I start thinking about that, I get pretty hopeful, right? I mean, I kind of say, oh, great, people are home with COVID, maybe a little bit more of a captive audience. My friends that have reached out to me have said, hey, I want to do the work. Give me some resources, help me figure this out. And so that piece I really like is that it sounds like people are willing to do the work. I think the resources are there. And then it becomes, how do we create, right? Like, how do we create as a community? Because I think, to your point about kind of distractions and losing attention is that, especially in civic engagement and in politics, is that you've got to be engaged over a long period of time. As we said, it doesn't move quickly. And so I think the work will be doing exactly that, is staying committed and making sure we're listening to those voices. But man, we got to pick some low-hanging fruit to keep people, along the way, to keep people interested in and motivated. And I think, we're seeing that a little bit in our country, but it'll be interesting to get input from folks around the world who have experienced stuff like this before. What's the low-hanging fruit? What's the easy stuff we can go after to feel good as a community? Because I think that's a big piece of our ability to sustain the effort, right? Which is like, man, I need a couple wins. I need to feel good about the progress we're making. And so I think that's the conversation I can't wait to have and to hear more of us engage in.
I'm hoping that day is sooner than later, for sure, because I mean, just in Louisiana, New Orleans was a hot spot for COVID. So the amount of effort and energy put into surviving the wave that Mardi Gras brought us of the virus and the deaths, and handling that, and everything being shut down, and taking care of these businesses and trying to bolster our community. It's like so much energy already put into that. I'm interested to see how the government's going to adjust and try and put the same energy into solving the issues that are police brutality or systematic racism that have come to the forefront again, as they do. They tend to do every probably 2 years. It's like this cycle. Right. It's a vicious cycle. We need to, there's another type of cycle that could be just a cycle of positivity, where we kind of slowly grow up, like you mentioned, whether that's teaching the government how to use Agile so that they have a backlog of projects that help us advance and let us see where we're getting the winners in, or if it's design thinking to actually involve the community in developing what we're going to do. These are all practices that exist, that are all well known, that some people have tried, but government is a giant ship. It's hard to turn, right? The best thing you can do to turn the ship is to get those lifeboats that are on the side, your little community, and try and make the change there, like we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And then from that, kind of help the boat change directions. Maybe like a little tugboat is a better example.
Oh yeah, no, I know. I was thinking, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that, we've all got to act like our own. These communities are tugboats that are going to help shift this bigger vessel, right, into the right direction. And I think that, we're there, and I think the work can be done. I think that there's such an interesting potential overlap between kind of that work from a civic and society and social perspective and the work that we do professionally, right? Is that the transference of those skills, is really potentially what we could see as like this explosion in terms of creativity and productivity and performance right now. Is that, man, if we can really start to address this, I think that it's an opportunity to show folks the true benefits of kind of creating these intercultural communities and intercultural teams that perform. Because, it's like you said, like, with your experience, would you go back to a less than diverse team? Would you want to work on a homogenous team, right? So given those choices, I'm curious, based on what you've seen and done, would you go back?
Yeah, no, never. It was, I could say I went from such an extreme diverse environment to IBM Spain was very much Spanish of a certain pedigree, right? And so flipping from one to the other was extremely frustrating to me, because I knew I had tasted what multicultural had given me and seen the results, like the actual tangible results, not just the experience of it. And working with people that all thought the same way, from the same type of families, I seem like the crazy person. And you can only seem like the crazy person for so long before you try and fall in line. The pressure does get to you. And even coming back to America, I felt like the crazy person again at a company. And it's hard to carry the weight of being the wild one. I guess it's like the duck that flies in the front of the V. You just get tired of flapping your wings and everybody trying to follow you. There definitely needs to be rotation.
Right.
Like you need to kind of build up this ability and take turns being the leader and pushing farther. And so I would never want to go back to that. And I grew up in a place that was very one-sided. I mean, I went to a small private school where wasn't really multicultural at all, hardly. To my master's degree was 17 different nationalities. So I want to keep moving in that arc, not going in the other direction, because I've learned so much from people that experienced different things from me that made me better, more skillful at what I do, but also just kind of a happier person. I wouldn't want to backpedal at all.
Yeah, and I like that. I like just the added thing of just making you a happier person. So
Yeah.
putting the effectiveness and the productivity and all those things aside, right? I mean, you're just a happier person. You've got this broader perspective that helps, at least speaking from my own perspective, it helps me navigate the world, right? I mean, even my own little local community, I can go to the grocery store and I can ask for stuff, or I can have these conversations, or I know what's going on a little bit within different communities. And so to me, that's, on a personal level, boy, that's got to feel really good.
Yeah. And one of the things is I find people fascinating. I find culture fascinating. And that's my great obsession, is learning more about other people, because it's like learning another language is like speaking a secret code. Well, it's the same thing with understanding another culture. It's like you stepped into this other realm where you see and experience things that are so far outside of your original understanding of everything that it just makes you feel like I need more. It's that curiosity, and I don't know. It really has made me a happier person, but I know that my practices to get to a bigger, broader perspective have been through travel, have been through sports. Thanks to soccer, I met people from all over the world too. So you just have to find your thing, and then be willing to learn it from wherever the source of information comes from, right? So be proactive in going out and learning from others.
Yeah, you bring up something that really got me thinking too about just, sources, and, not necessarily everybody has the opportunity to, as you said before, travel or get the job that puts you on the road or something like that. But, I'm thinking about, I've got a teenage son, who is, especially during COVID, has become really interested in gaming.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to see how wide the gaming community is, So, he's got these folks in Japan, and he's got folks in South America and all over, that he's exposed to. And so it's just another way that you can get that, right? As opposed to just hopping on some server and playing with your buddies or something like that. He's out there saying, hey, I want to play with people from all over the world just to see what it's like and see what we can figure out. And, that's just another one of those opportunities, I think, to get that exposure that's just so valuable. So, you said I'm a big culture guy too. Like, I just appreciate going in and being able to experience different cultures, and so we talk about tips. Like, to me, it's going to a restaurant even, right? So people, right, if you can just go out and have that experience and sit down at the restaurant, and I know that's not a big COVID thing right now. But to do that, or to watch a movie, it's all there. Oh, look who's here.
Yeah. Hey, Edgar.